Auburn going to Alabama. If you're an Alabama fan, you're like, praise the Lord, we don't have to go to Jordan-Hare this year. Alabama, 11.5-point favorite, 3:30 Eastern, ABC, Bryant-Denny. This is college football rivalry, I think, at its purest. Because for Alabama now, are they 110% out of the college football playoff? No, I think ESPN gives them like a 20% chance to somehow still make the dance. Need a lot of help. That's straightforward. But like this game would mean something regardless of where you played it, regardless of who had what number of wins. This is also a game now that before last week, you still threw out records when you went into this game because weird things happen regardless of where it's played. But especially because of how last week went with Auburn starting to put it together, looking like the Auburn team that I think a lot of us expected them to look like offensively, scoring over 40 points. Then Alabama looking just like nobody was home against a pretty lackluster Oklahoma team who became bowl eligible by beating you if you're Alabama. So when it comes to this game and what makes it pure, again, it's all about this game. Like playoff, no playoff, BCS, whatever you want to talk about, like this game to those fan bases is everything and anything you care about 365 days a year. So it'll be very, very pure in that sense. And also, there's already some trash talk coming in. Setting the tone are the folks from Auburn. Cam Coleman saying we're going to go ahead and take over their spot. I believe it was DeMarcus Riddick who says, like, I am not losing to Bama while I'm here. So the gauntlet has been thrown down. And I absolutely love that when it comes to this rivalry game. The matchup I'm watching here that I think could just dictate the entire game to begin with is the Auburn team speed on defense against Jalen Milroe on the ground. Now, Jalen Milroe as a passer we'll talk about here in a second, but like what he does running the football, that starts the car. Like this offense, when it gets rolled, it's a Ferrari, but you don't turn the keys unless Jalen Milroe has something going on the ground. Of all three of Bama's losses, Jalen Milroe has had the following rushing yard: 10 yards against Vandy, 11 yards against Tennessee, 7 yards against Oklahoma. Those are three of his 4 lowest rushing yard totals on the year. The other came against USF, where I think he had like 2 yards rushing. You factor in some sacks there. The bottom line is, if Jalen Milroe is not able to run the football at an effective level, Alabama struggles offensively. And it's not because they don't have other guys. It's because for whatever reason, they're not able to maximize those other skill players outside of a Ryan Williams without Jalen Milroe's legs demanding more attention. So I think in this spot now, you look at Auburn and what they do against mobile quarterbacks. Auburn is pretty good actually against the run. They're allowing 3 yards a carry, which is number 11 in college football. However, look at who they've played that are not a Jalen Milroe skill set, but also mobile quarterbacks, because no one's Jalen Milroe, but like Taylor Green from Arkansas, right? Mobile quarterback, long strider, can hurt you on the ground. Auburn allowed 80 yards rushing. Michael Hawkins Jr., Auburn's defense probably played well enough to win that football game, if not for a pick six from Oklahoma. Michael Hawkins Jr. had 70 yards on the ground. Marcel Reed, last week, Auburn won that football game. However, I think it was more interesting than you would like if you're an Auburn fan. You allowed them to come back from 21-zip because Marcel Reed had 66 yards on the ground. So I think the way that I fall on this, if I'm an Auburn fan, is like, I'm cool if Jalen Milroe gets 65 yards on the ground. If he gets 65 yards and 15 carries, like, hey, man, we'll live with it. We'll live with it. I think that's a game that we can still win. The game that you can't win is where Jalen Milroe has 65 yards on the ground on 1 carry, and then you're like, hey, we got to figure something else out. Because at that point in time, everything else opens up. Ryan Williams, he's already a problem when you give him extra attention with the safety in the corner. But at that point in time, hey, safety, we got to roll down and play Jalen Milroe's legs. So at that point in time, Ryan Williams, he's got one-on-one coverage. Game blouses, that's an advantage for Alabama every single time. You open it up for some of your other running backs. Like, things start to kind of have this spiral effect if Auburn allows the explosive play with Jalen Milroe on the ground. Makes me a little bit nervous. Now, speaking to what they got to do with kind of trying to create something else offensively outside of his legs, this has got to be the Kalen DeBoer game, right? Because last week was, I think, embarrassing is a word you would use, which is not, I don't think, too harsh of a word to use for an Alabama fan with what you had offensively. And this was Kalen DeBoer's bag, man. Like, this is how he cut his teeth as a head coach in college football. Like this is why he is the guy that you hired, because he's an offensive mastermind. And the thing that you loved so much last year about the Washington team was it could be anybody's game any given day. Whether it be Roma Dunze, whether it be Bernard, whether it be Polk, and that's another team. Those guys are a lot of NFL wide receivers, and you got an NFL quarterback back there spinning it. But the point remains the same. Kalen DeBoer and his offensive structure would allow guys to get open. It could be multiple attacks. We haven't seen that this year. So against this Auburn defense, Need to see a little bit more of it. Haven't had, I think, a year that has made as much waves as the Auburn fan base would like, but that defense is still solid, man. Defense is still a very stout unit when it comes to what they're doing statistically. College football sickos, make sure you're subscribed right here to the On3 YouTube channel. Game predictions like this one, analysis, signing day around the corner, make sure you're locked in. This show brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks. Free pick for Thanksgiving weekend. You got Tyreek Hill, 99% off. He gets a half-yard receiving. That cashes. Pair it with another square. You're off to the races. So use code HARDCOUNT. Playing $5 in lineups gets you $50 in promo funds, again, over at prizepicks.com using code HARDCOUNT. Now back to the prediction. Now, offensively for Auburn, we spoke to the legacy games that are available to a guy like Cade Klubnik against South Carolina with Clemson. This has to be the Peyton Thorne legacy game. Because the game breaker that you have here, the advantage that you have, is, I think, Cam Coleman against that Alabama secondary. Alabama, again, statistically, has not been bad this year against the pass, but you've seen now in different moments against mobile quarterbacks that can kind of see the picture, they've struggled. When it goes to guys that see the picture, Carson Beck went for over 400 yards. That's, its own conversation. But guys like Lenora Sellers got after him. Nico Iamaleava got after him. Jackson Arnold on the ground had a phenomenal day, over 100 yards. Diego Pavia, like guys that are dual threat quarterbacks. Jackson Arnold didn't necessarily light them up through the air, but you hear the point I'm making here. The attention that's divided between the defense when Peyton Thorne can scramble or can hurt you on the ground with like the read option game or the design quarterback run, that forces more pressure on the back end of your defense. Going back to what I just said, Cam Coleman, game breaker here. The less attention you can allow the Alabama defense to play with him is going to give you, I think, a greater percentage chance to win this football game. Cam Coleman also is coming on in the most important part of the year if you're Auburn, fighting to make a bowl right now. And, 100 yards each of his last two games. Had a massive day against A&M. Was in a large way the reason you won that football game. So, got to be able to create isolated matchups for him. And then Peyton Thorne, we got to hit the shot here, baby. It's been a tough year for Peyton Thorne. It is hard for me to not root for Peyton Thorne based on all the things that have been said about him, all of the blame he's taken, both publicly and I'm sure behind closed doors. Like, Peyton Thorne, if you can go out and beat Alabama, you have 3 touchdowns through the air and you go for 300 yards again like you did last weekend. You have 2 of those touchdowns to Cam Coleman. Like, the conversation around Peyton Thorne, I think, would shift in a big way heading into Auburn making the bowl. Now, if I'm Hugh Freeze, I watched what Oklahoma did. Let's do that. Not to oversimplify it, but we saw Oklahoma, go to town in the run game. I mentioned Jackson Arnold had over 100 yards. I think Oklahoma had darn near over 250 yards on the ground as a football team. Why? Movement pre-snap, forcing the Alabama defense into situations where they had to pick a decision on the option game, and it got them out of sorts, and Oklahoma gashed them repeatedly. Jarquez Hunter is the domino effect to me in this game. If he can get going, everything else opens up. Peyton Thorne's legs, those safeties have to roll down. You give Cam Coleman a chance against those other young corners on the perimeter. Like, that to me makes this whole thing go and could honestly be the difference maker. Now, a big reason why Alabama lost last weekend is Jalen Milroe having just some uncharacteristic turnovers. Look at those 3 picks. Only one, in my opinion, you really pin on him. One, he got pressure. The other just didn't really seem like it was a Jalen Milroe error. Like the receiver made an issue there. It was just not necessarily on number 4. I don't think Jalen Milroe has 2 games in a row a just disaster turnover showing. I'm not as confident as well in Auburn's defense against mobile quarterbacks. I spoke to what those other quarterbacks did against them on the ground. I think as long as that's still the reality for Alabama at home, I think they should feel good about their chances. Now, if this was in Jordan-Hare, I would pick Auburn. But I pair all the matchups together, the mobile quarterbacks, Peyton Thorne having to play a clean game 2 games in a row, and I look at the letdown potential of Auburn after an emotional multiple overtime win over A&M, and then the bounce-back potential that I think Alabama has here. I'm going to take Alabama to win. I'm going to take Alabama not to cover. I wouldn't touch the spread. I think the final score is 31-24 in Bryant-Denny. So I think the Tide get it done. Kalen DeBoer gets his 9th win as the head coach in Tuscaloosa. I think that's how this game goes. I'll say this, though, before we move on to our next game prediction. If Auburn loses, they miss a bowl game. All right? Frustrating. Probably a a world that you allowed yourself to live in a little bit with how poorly things started at the beginning of the year. If Alabama loses and goes to 8-4, if you're that fan base, you feel like you might as well not be in a bowl game. Like that would be the way it feels. So we'll keep an eye on that one and obviously give you our reactions the Sunday following. But that's going to be a lot of fun. I cannot wait for that Iron Bowl. Feels a lot more open than it did maybe a couple of weeks ago, or last week, I suppose, before Auburn beat A&M and Alabama did not show up against Oklahoma.